Hi everyone, it's me, Tim, and today I want to talk about story versus game design. Or, as Shearsner asks, what is more important for a game, story or game design? I know ideally there should be a balance between the two, but that is so rare to find. What's your view on it? Sorry, I got a tickle in my throat today. So let me say, first of all, this is a good question, but maybe not for the reason you think I'm going to say it's a good question. Let's take a look at it. First of all, what do you mean by game design? Because story is part of game design. So saying what's more important, story or game design, well, story is part of game design, so game design. Now, maybe what you meant by game design was system mechanics, the rules that get made by the designer for how the game is played. Maybe you meant setting. Oh, maybe you meant the user experience, UX. Or maybe you meant any of the number of other things that can fall under the umbrella of game design. So, in one sense, it's a trick question. Because me asking you what you mean by game design is itself a trick question. Mine is a trick question because it doesn't really matter what you say. When you could tell me by game design you meant anything, and I'd have the same answer. Yours is a trick question because the answer of story versus game design varies by game or even by genre. So I will break that down and we'll talk about that. First off, I have played games that have almost no story and they're still super fun. That's pretty much every game made, not all of them, but a lot of them made in the 80s and 90s. The story was such a thin veneer on the game that today would be called a setting. Doom's story was demons are loose on a base and you have to stop them. That's a setting. The story would be some scientist was doing an experiment and the demons got out and they're going to take over the earth, and unless you can stop them before a certain amount of time or before something else happens, and there are characters you have to interact with and there are acts to the story and all that. Saying there are demons in a base and you should go kill them all is more of a setting. However, for some people that's a good enough story, especially for that kind of game. For shooters and FPSs, it's pretty much okay to have very little story. You don't need a lot of story to prop those games up. Conversely, though, I've played a lot of games that have very, very little design. And by design, in this case, I mean system mechanics, past a storytelling experience. Although, I've also played games that have very little in the way of interface. Pretty much they consist of games, you've all played these, where you go from location to location and then a story is exposited. Your only choice, your only agency is what rooms to go to in what order, and within the room what to click on. And that's pretty much all you can do is you interact with something and then a little story is told. Or you enter a room and a story is told. So there really isn't much to those games besides someone wanted to tell a story and they decided to do it in a game format. Sometimes it's completely linear. Often, especially lately, people have gotten better at telling stories in a non-linear fashion. So you yourself have to put together the pieces and figure out what the story order was. But because these two extremes exist of games with very little story and games with very little mechanics, I hope that makes you understand that the question of what's better, story or game design, is actually a non-question. It's like the Buddhist question of does a dog have Buddha nature, and you're supposed to just go mew. You unask the question. The question itself is not, it's not even that it's not relevant. The question itself contains its own unasking, it's no longer a logical question. Like the are you still beating your spouse question. I never have beaten my spouse, so do you keep beating your spouse is it's a non-question. So Similarly, you might have said, hey, what's better, graphics or setting? Well, again, depending on the game, some games really better have a really good graphics. But when you think about the graphics, part of what makes graphics so good is a very thematic look to it, which is very dependent on the setting. So it's hard to tease these things apart. And I hope that's what you're hearing me say. For most games, it's hard to tease apart one element from another. However, many games do rest most of their interesting features on one of those areas. You may have played a game that's really good, just beautiful, and that's why you played it. You may have played another game because it had really fun puzzles. You may have played another game because it has really good combat. Maybe you played a game because it has a really good story, and maybe you played a game because it has really good mechanics. If you're lucky, you get a game that has all those, but not every game needs all those. Some need a lot more of one than the other. If you were playing a real-time shooter, if you're playing Counter-Strike, do you really want to stop to get story elements while the other people are running around possibly shooting at you? No. Similarly, if you're playing an adventure game, well, those don't even really need combat. You just walk around and you talk to people and a story's told. There have been very popular games like that have come out recently. So some games need more of one of those things than others. Most need all of them. So to answer your question about what's more important for a game, story or game design, I would say some games need more of those than another, but most need both, just like any other element of the design. So, Shearsner, I hope this answers your question, and I hope this gives you an interesting way of looking at games going forward.